How's it going, guys? Today's video is all about nature portraiture. Now, this beginner tutorial is originally from my 9-hour-long online photography masterclass, which you can check out down below. It's a beginner photo course that I think you'll really enjoy, all never before seen content. And I'll talk more about it at the end of the video. For now, enjoy the tutorial.
You made it so easy.
How's it going, guys? Today I'm going to be teaching nature portraiture, where I show you some awesome strategies on shooting outdoor portraits when you're on a good adventure. Now, to do this, I'm going to break it down into my 3 favorite strategies for shooting these photos, followed by tons of tips and tricks on posing, shooting, and then using the manual settings in your camera to grab these awesome photos. Now, if you've ever seen any other videos on portraiture, this video is going to be a little bit different because typically in portraiture, the main focus is just your subject and everything else is sort of the backstory to that. In this video, we're going to be talking about your subject as a component. So sometimes they're going to be the most important part of the shot. Other times, they're just going to be an extra element that helps form together a better landscape photo. So I'll be introducing you to 3 different strategies to help visualize this, and I think it'll really help with improving your nature portraiture. Now, there are 3 strategies we'll be covering: landscape first, portraiture first, and scenery first. And knowing which of these you're going to be pursuing will help you refine your composition and framing, improve your posing, and help you nail down the necessary settings on your camera. So let's jump into this. First off, landscape first technique. So earlier in this section, I talked about how you want to add a foreground element to your composition photos to make them more interesting. So using the layer cake analogy, the foundation is just your scene in the background, and then the second layer is going to be your foreground element. So in the same way that trees or rocks or anything can be your foreground element, so can people. So essentially in this technique, we're prioritizing the landscape, and then we throw in a person to make it a little bit more interesting, in the same way we'd use rocks and such. Essentially, this is just a landscape photo that also has a person in there, but not the main focus. Now, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have number 2, our portraiture first technique. And this is the exact opposite. It's when you focus on portraiture and use the landscape more as a background element that's not quite as important to the photo. So it's landscape with a portrait thrown in versus portrait with a landscape thrown in. And finally, we have number 3, our scene first technique. This tends to be my favorite type of outdoor people photos, and it's a bit of a combination between portraiture and landscape first techniques because it's about your friends engaging in the scene. So rather than just them looking pretty like a portrait, it's them actually doing some sort of action, whether it's walking, hiking, running, jumping, swimming, whatever it might be. And it also brings a lot of the focus to the scene because they're interacting with it. And these are our 3 strategies. Now, it's important to remember 2 things. First, that these are blurred lines between the 3 strategies, and sometimes you might take a photo that incorporates the landscape just as much as the portraiture element. And second, these are strategies to help you think about portraiture in different ways, but at the end of the day, they are all still portraits. And that takes us to the actual shooting process. So I'm going to break this down into 9 steps, and then break down some of these steps individually based on the 3 shooting strategies. First off, let's talk about gear. Now, in these past landscape photos, we've been using a tripod often because the scenery is going to be really consistent. But because our subjects now are moving live people, we're probably going to want to be handheld so we can be versatile, move around with them, and try a bunch of different things. As far as lenses go, the most popular ones are going to be fast lenses, meaning they have a wide aperture possible, as well as large focal lengths, meaning they're more zoomed in. So a really popular beginner lens here is the 50mm 1.8. And these shallow apertures help you blur the background so you have more focus moving toward your subject, which is a great thing for portraiture. 85mm lenses are also popular for portraiture, and I like to use my 24-105 lens. Even though it's got a minimum aperture of f4, it can still take a nice photo. In 2 preliminary settings, it's going to be business as usual here, so make sure you're shooting in RAW with white balance of either cloudy or auto, and set your camera to manual mode. Now, I'll also be giving some aperture priority tips if you're not feeling quite up to full manual yet, but I highly recommend you try it, and I'll make it pretty easy for you. Step 3, composition. Now, we don't just want to throw our subject into the shot, we want to find a way to nicely integrate them with our composition. So a couple great composition techniques for that are: 1, framing. So try framing your subject just under a mountain, right over a mountain. Frame them in the sky is always a great move because that's a nice clear backdrop. Really just find a place in the photo that's very simple or isolated that helps your subject pop out. Because if there's a busy background right behind them, they kind of mix in with the photo and that's no good. 2, look for leading lines that'll help guide the viewer's eye to your subject. So you might find that in trails and any sort of long path or road. Also, trees are always nice solid lines that you can use either as guiding lines or just frame your subject between those trees. Always a solid move. And step 4, posing your subject. So we're going to start with posing for the landscape first technique. Because the focus of the photo is more about the landscape than your friend, we want to have your friend in a pose that also complements the landscape. So rather than drawing big attention with these flashy gestures and poses like this that you see with the Instagram models all the time, we want to do something a little more understated. So consider having your friend just looking out into the distance, maybe standing, maybe sitting. They could even have their backs to you when they're looking out, which is a really great move for your uglier friends. Additionally, you probably don't want them to be looking directly at the camera, instead looking more off in the distance. The same casual posing applies to facial expression too. It looks weird if your friend is just beaming off into the distance like so. So have them be like neutral faced or just lightly smiling, something a little more natural. An important note, just because we want the photo to look natural doesn't mean it has to be shot naturally. So don't be afraid to tell your friend to take on or put off a backpack, to move in a certain direction, or even set the scene for him and be like, hey, can you look like you've just finished a long hike and you're finally winding down? Because that'll help your model know exactly what to look like, and doing this will really help solidify the mood of your photos. And 4B, posing the portrait first photos. Now we're gonna have our subject facing us. They can even be looking at the camera if you like, and you can try some much bolder poses. For some inspiration, I recommend you follow 2 Instagram accounts. Pursuit of Portraits is awesome, and Portraits NYC also has some really good inspiration. Take a look at how they're doing it, and maybe try recreating some of those moves. And there's also tons of articles out there that'll help you learn how to pose your models. So don't be afraid to Google model posing techniques. You'll get millions of articles, all very good. A nice little life hack here. If your friend is ever being kind of stiff and awkward, what you should have them do is get out of whatever pose you have them in, have them do 1 jumping jack, and then immediately get back to that pose they're in. And they're gonna automatically be much looser. Now, if your friend isn't very comfortable with themselves, you might be better off going for the landscape first sort of posing, where they're just looking out and being simple, versus the flamboyant, strutting your body sort of portraiture that you oftentimes see on Instagram. But depends on who your model is. And finally, 4C, posing your subject for the scene first photos. Now, because we're actually shooting something that's really happening, we want our photos to be as authentic as possible. So what we can do for this, we have a couple options. So first, we can actually shoot candid photos, meaning our subjects won't even know that we're shooting them, just be kind of sneaky and secretive about it. If that's not possible, you can be forward and tell your subject that you're shooting, but just tell them to keep doing whatever they're doing and ignore you. So if your subject is roasting marshmallows, just no matter where you're standing, just keep roasting that marshmallow. Oftentimes what I'll do is when I see a great photo opportunity, like my friends walking through a certain frame, I'll tell them to stop and wait before they walk through it so I can get set up, and then have them actually walk through as they normally would and shoot the photo. And sometimes I'll actually have to say, hey, could you guys go back and walk through it 1 more time? Now, an important note here, this is a great opportunity for goofy pictures. Just let your friends be themselves and try and capture the scene without trying to make it look perfect and all aesthetic, because sometimes these are the photos that might not look great in a portfolio, but are gonna be just cherished memories. Like take this photo of my friend Kyle eating chips and drinking beer. That's very much what he does on these trips. And even though it's not a killer photo, I love it all the same. And step number 5, lighting. Now, the lighting for all 3 of these strategies is gonna be the same. And the main thing here to note is that golden hour is gonna be amazing for portraits. It's honestly the best time of day for them because the lighting is really soft and flattering, and it can look good on pretty much any way it hits your subject. Now, the 2 most popular ways to shoot during golden hour are 1, have the light hit your subject directly in the face. So have them posed toward the light and it comes and hits them. You could also have them facing directly away from the light because it'll then illuminate their hair and backlight them, which looks really, really awesome. But this will definitely look best during golden hour. Now, you can shoot good portraits during the middle of the day. I recommend then putting your subject in shadows maybe, but you'll find that when you actually go out shooting during golden hour, your portraits will look much, much better. So I recommend holding out. To take full advantage of the light, you should think about posing your subject in 2 waves. The first wave being putting their body in a nice natural position. position, and then having them turn their head so that the light hits them in the most flattering way. Another great move during golden hour is to look for light baths, which are when you have these large splotches of light that are otherwise surrounded by shadows. And this will happen when there's anything to obstruct the light. So if you're in a forest during golden hour, you'll find nice light baths, and if you pose your subject anywhere in those baths of light, they're gonna look really awesome. And step number 6, we're now gonna set our aperture. Now, remember that aperture, shutter speed, and ISO all counterbalance each other, and our most important attribute here is gonna be aperture, because it's gonna affect the depth of field of the photo. Now, to have your subject properly pop out, as I was saying earlier, a shallow depth of field is very popular. So what I recommend you do is have a pretty shallow depth of field with a very small aperture number. So try f1.8, 2.8, somewhere in that range, and see how that looks. It's also good to have these low aperture numbers because it lets in more light, which gives you more flexibility with your shutter speed and ISO. Remember that all lenses have different minimum aperture numbers. Some lenses will go all the way down to 1.2, some stop at f4. So I recommend using one of your faster lenses, meaning one that goes to a smaller aperture number. If you want to keep things a little bit more simple, you can turn your camera to aperture priority mode, and same thing, bring it down to a very low aperture number, say 2.8 or so, and now set your ISO, if it's very bright outside, to a very low number, like 100 or 200. If it's getting to be a little bit darker, set your ISO to 400 to 800 or so, and now you're just gonna have an automatically set shutter speed, so you don't have to worry about that. But if you're feeling more ambitious, stick with me and I'll walk you through using manual settings for your shutter speed. Now, a quick note on using shallow depth of field. You want your subject to pop out, and using a shallow depth of field is very helpful for this, but you don't necessarily want your background to be so blurry that you can't even identify it anymore, especially if it's like a beautiful mountain range or something. So if you're taking a close-up photo, try not to have your aperture be too small of a number, because that'll prompt a very shallow depth of field and maybe even an over-blurred background. Now, if your subject is pretty far away, then you can still use a very wide open aperture and your background won't be too blurry. So take this photo I shot of my friend Josh. This is very wide, shooting at f1.4, but because he was already far away enough from the camera, the background isn't too blurry, which is great. And step number 7, shutter speed. Now, our main goal here is to have the slowest possible shutter speed because it'll give us more flexibility with aperture and ISO. That's just fast enough to ensure we don't have any blur in our photo from 1, camera shaking, or 2, our subject moving. Now remember, for your camera shaking, the basic rule of thumb is a shutter speed that's the same as your lens's focal length. So if you have a 200mm lens, 1/200th of a second, 50mm lens, 1/50th of a second. And you can consult this chart if you want to be a little more precise with that. To give you guys some guidelines for shutter speed, ideally don't go slower than 1/125th of a second, because I think that's just fast enough to account for any sort of average model movement. If it's getting dark out and you're really strapped for lighting, try not to go slower than 1/60th of a second, but even then you gotta make sure your model is super still, because any sort of motion might mess up your shot. And if you're shooting any sort of action like jumping, running, or climbing really fast, then you're gonna want a faster shutter speed to ensure that there's no blur. So 1/500th of a second is a good place for that. Now, something to bear in mind, if you're shooting toward the nighttime, then you're gonna probably be really strapped on your shutter speed, trying to make it as slow as possible to let in more light. Versus if you're shooting in the middle of the day, you might actually have too much light because you have such a wide open aperture that even at ISO 100, you're gonna have to make your shutter speed super fast to make sure your photo is properly exposed. So your shutter speed during the middle of the day could get all the way to 1/2000th of a second. So if you're shooting in the middle of the day and your lens is wide open at say f1.8, even if your ISO is at 100, you might have to have a really fast shutter speed. And step number 8, setting your ISO. This is the final of the 3 in the exposure triangle, so we're just gonna make sure our shot is now properly exposed and setting our ISO at whatever it needs to be. Now, a quick rule of thumb, if your ISO gets to be above, say, 800, it's gonna get a little bit grainy. So what I recommend you do there is either slow down your shutter speed or open up your aperture a little more by bringing the number down, so a wider aperture. I like to use live view until this looks good in the LCD screen and then take some test shots to make sure it's perfect. Now, a couple issues you might have with ISO. If it's getting to be very dark out and your ISO starts to get really high, beyond say 1600, you should probably start to either 1, make your shutter speed slower, or 2, make your aperture number smaller, making your aperture wider and letting in more light, so you'll be able to have a lower ISO. And 2, if you're shooting in the middle of the day with a wide open aperture at say 1.8, then you actually might have too bright of a shot even when your ISO is at 100, the bare minimum. So to adjust for this, you're gonna actually have to raise your shutter speed to be faster, and that's totally no problem. And step number 9, focus. Now choosing what you should focus on does depend what the primary subject of the shot is, but typically when you have a person in the shot, they command a lot of attention, and I recommend focusing on them. There are some exceptions to the rule. For example, this photo I shot of my friend Josh, the mountains in his camera lens were definitely the main focus of the shot, and he was sort of secondary to that. For portraiture, when you're using such a shallow depth of field, you do want to be very precise about how you focus on your model. The most popular way to do this is to focus on the eyes, and if there's one eye that's closer to you, focus on that one. So I like to use autofocus for that because at 1.4 or 1.8 with these really shallow depths of field, it's very hard to trust your eye. Just trust the computer, it'll be solid for you. And to learn more about how to focus your camera, you can go back to section 3 where I talk all about focusing methods. My main thing here though is I highly recommend you focus with autofocus because it's going to be much more precise than shooting and focusing with your eye. Just trust me on this and trust the machines. And on that eerily post-futuristic note, I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you so much for watching. Have an amazing time shooting portraits, and I'll see you in the next video. Hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, you should definitely check out my masterclass. It's 9 hours long for beginners, covering everything from choosing the right gear, shooting, editing, marketing your work online, and much more. I think you'll really enjoy it. And all of the content is exclusive. I just uploaded 1 or 2 of these videos from it just to give you guys a taste of it, but the rest is never before seen. Also, if you take any shots of portraits that you're really proud of, I would love to see them because that is the reason why I teach. So be sure to post them up on Instagram using the hashtag joshkatzphotos and tagging me at joshkatz so I can check it out. Anyway guys, since I'm filming this video on my ramp right now, here's a little clip from that. And that is all I have to say. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you eventually.